This presentation is based on two research projects that I've been working on lately that are forthcoming in print shortly. One is an international study of climate change skepticism in the US, the UK, France, and Germany that's co-authored with a few other scholars. And so it's a kind of exercise in compassionate listening to the skeptical arguments about climate change and what sense to make of them and how to build bridges between different positions on the climate. The other is a collection of essays about my Latter-day Saint faith and what I've been calling stewardship, but Margaret's challenged me to maybe think of another word. But I've written a collection of essays that will be published by the Maxwell Institute and Deseret book called The Hope of Nature that hopefully will appear in print before too long. Those are the two projects that kind of inform what I'm going to do here. Climate change has presented many challenges to our capacity and willingness to respond. In diagnosing some of the reasons for these challenges, as I attempt to do here from a Latter-day Saint perspective, I do not pretend that there are any of us who are without sin, as it were. To some degree or another, we all willingly push aside the disturbing facts of environmental degradation generally and climate change in particular, and we continue to contribute to the problems we face. The only way I know how to find meaningful change in my own life as a member of my faith is through repentance. And repentance requires recognizing the mistakes I have made, understanding the roots of those mistakes, and finding a reason for hope to believe that I have the necessary resources to make a change. This presentation is an attempt to provide a brief gloss on what I consider to be the roots of climate change skepticism, particularly in a Latter-day Saint context, and what I believe are some resources that can help motivate meaningful change. Much of what I will say about skepticism is not unique to the phenomenon known as Mormonism, but I will argue that Latter-day Saints have more than sufficient grounds for believing in and caring about climate change. I will not have the space here to provide examples, but simply to provide an overview of principles. Climate change presents a number of unique challenges to Americans in general and to Latter-day Saints in particular, and I will outline first a few of the political challenges that I will then describe are exacerbated by certain cosmological challenges. Even though studies show that views of climate change today are more directly dictated by partisan affiliation than by religion, it is the religious overtone to the reaction that has made change more difficult. So here then are four political challenges. Let me just see if I can, okay, yeah, it's working. So faith over secularism. Because climate change is assumed to be a cause that emerges from such secular institutions as higher education, international bodies such as the UN, mainstream media, and large scientific societies, the alarms raised about the fate of species and oceans and watersheds are deemed both inaccurate or of little concern. In other words, in our cultural moment, where we see a conflict between opposing epistemologies, imagined to be mutually exclusive and in direct competition with one another, we are at odds. And although Latter-day Saint theology, I think, is science-friendly and promotes civic engagement, suspicions remain about the rising threat of secularism. Secondly, people, not trees. Although there is nothing inherently liberal or conservative, I would argue, about the reality of climate change, and although it has enjoyed brief moments of bipartisan support, attitudes today are often polarized by what are also perceived to be dueling and mutually exclusive concerns, either about the human economy on the one hand or about the ecological economy on the other. This polarization has meant that climate change appears to force a choice between the spotted owl and the logger. And much of the resistance to climate change mitigation among conservatives has come from legitimate concerns about the costs of mitigation. Even when they assume climate change is real and human cause, some skeptics will insist that mitigation is both too costly and too ineffective. And in a strongly family-centered theology like we find in Latter-day Saint faith, it is a hard sell to worry about more than human life. 3, American exceptionalism. Just want to make sure American exceptionalism, but not internationalism. climate change has exposed an urgent need for international collaboration. And this is one reason why those who feel especially strongly about American exceptionalism or isolationism are more inclined to bristle at or actively resist suggestions for the need for such collaboration and raise concerns about related compromises. For Latter-day Saints, such political inclinations are additionally bolstered by the fact of the religion's origins in this country and readings of the Book of Mormon that claim special status for the United States. I would suggest, and it's a longer conversation, but the Book of Mormon is germane to all of the Western Hemisphere and not only to the United States. But these readings that are limited to the lens of the United States as a nation are themselves a product of the initial impulses of what was once a predominantly American membership. Fourth, individual freedoms, but not regulations. Climate change has as yet not resulted in smaller government. The cry instead has been not only for international treaties, but for broad and sweeping regulations or taxes that can quickly shift the economy, energy economy away from fossil fuels. It is not entirely clear that climate change makes larger government inevitable, however, until and unless conservatives get serious about identifying conservative solutions, we may never know. But the point is that for those already disposed to believe that smaller government is categorically better government, and that regulations are irritants and even obstacles in what is an otherwise smoothly operating free market system that is best left alone, climate change is a bitter pill to swallow. Because so much emphasis is placed on individual accountability and the need to protect free agency in our theology, Latter-day Saints readily share conservative suspicions of the dangers of big government and international treaties. This distrust has also been shaped by the historical experience of fleeing persecution at the hands of state and federal governments. Today, many in our rural communities in Utah, for example, federal policies can sometimes exercise a disproportionate influence on local lifeways and economies. So that's enough about politics for now. I'm sure there'll be questions. What makes these obstacles even more challenging is that deeper and more cosmological beliefs have imbued these political leanings with theological weight, and this has hardened the resistance, I think, to the reality of climate change. This explains why people often resist claims about the climate not merely out of political preference or honest disagreement about science, but with a kind of cosmological urgency. When the phenomenon of climate change appears to undermine the very existence of the universe as one imagined it to be, it is not hard to understand why one might deny it, or as if one's very existence depended on it. Indeed, it is often suggested that climate change isn't happening because one's theology suggests that it can't happen. This is a common argument that I've read frequently in the writings of Senator James Inhofe, for example, or Sarah Palin. So here are 4 cosmological challenges that have contributed to such resistance and have led to this kind of impasse. First, accountability. The moral urgency of the climate crisis notwithstanding, scholars have noted that climate change challenges traditional conceptions of ethical responsibility. Climate change is a global phenomenon that is measured by global averages that are the result of millions of individual contributions of carbon emissions over many generations. So even though we cannot measure carbon footprint, even though we can measure carbon footprints of individuals, corporations, and even nations, it is difficult, if not irresponsible, to argue that all emissions are equally suspect morally. Measuring emissions alone cannot distinguish between an individual act of driving a sick person to the hospital and a comparable drive to yet another round of golf, or in my case, to the next trailhead for mountain biking. It cannot distinguish between an American flying to Hawaii for vacation and a comparable flight of a Syrian refugee to the United States, or between a military conflict and a humanitarian effort that emit the same amount of carbon. So and there's a lot written about this in philosophy, but when it comes to emissions, there is, in short, no clear and proportionate relationship between intention, action, and consequence, and this is very difficult for all of us. In the Latter-day Saint tradition, individual agency and accountability are deemed centrally important to our individual development, and we are used to thinking of our use of agency as something that can be judged in terms of its direct consequences. Secondly, temporality. If we can't see the damage, or if making amends will never be seen in a lifetime, the urgency to make amends is harder to feel. To properly understand climate change, we need to have a sense of deep time in the Earth's long history, and we need to place within the sphere of our moral concern a future that extends at least to the next 20, if not 100 or 150 years. And we have either lost or never fully developed such a moral imagination. And the challenge is that such an imagination is needed most at a time when the short cycles of a corporation's annual profit margins and of political elections have come to dominate our sense of urgency, what one scholar calls American short-termism. I think what is perhaps especially challenging in this regard for Latter-day Saints is indicated in our name. While millennialism isn't unique to Latter-day Saints, it is particularly emphasized in our theology. A Latter-day Church understands itself to be on limited time, and it is unfortunately not yet exceedingly rare or unheard of for a Latter-day Saint to wonder out loud, if the earth is going to die anyway, why should I bother taking care of it? Third, oops, I'm not even on 2, there we go, the human role in history. You can see that climate change starts to challenge some deeply held beliefs about the very moral fabric of the universe and its teleology, or its direction. Agency is more collective and stretched out over time, and perhaps more importantly, more tragic, at least potentially, than we have thought. Good intentions can go awry. Consequences are now more disproportionate to intentions, and thus it isn't always clear which individuals bear the responsibility, nor where are we headed. I should say, by way of a pause here, that climate change isn't unique in this way. I mean, we face the same problem when it comes to air pollution, for example. I mean, we have Chinese air pollution in Utah that comes across the Pacific, so that creates some similar kinds of problems in terms of measuring ethical responsibility. And so climate change seems to raise questions about God's sovereignty. In the wake of World War II, as American democracy, technology, and economy blossomed, we had come to believe in the almost limitless capacity of individuals and the almost limitless capacity of the earth to provide adequate resources for such potential. This was well suited to Latter-day Saint theology, which is optimistic and hopeful about the future, hopeful about science and technology, and trustful of God's purposes. As a relatively cheap and available energy source, fossil fuels were a blessing that became the energy source that fueled the revolutionary ideas of human development and freedom. To have to now reimagine it as a threat means having to adopt a cosmology that appears to be more vulnerable to tragedy, less certain about human destiny, and where it is possible for human societies to collapse because of collective structural problems that are not always directly or always attributable to human flaws. It also raises the question in the minds of many Latter-day Saints, if climate change is such a serious threat and we are so responsible, why haven't church leaders revealed more about it? And I should add that on Wednesday, Elder Snow quoted from Elder Oaks, who spoke about climate change, at least in my mind, in my recollection, for the first time last February, about the reality of climate change in a speech he gave in Hawaii. And Elder Snow then said, and I quote from him on Wednesday, "Climate change is real, and it is our responsibility as stewards to do what we can to limit the damage done to God's creation." And I can share more about his remarks. And there is a brief gloss on his remarks in the Mormon newsroom, or it is now known, the newsroom. As if there's only one in the world, right? The newsroom. The human role in nature. Climate change has stimulated a great debate about the role of human beings in nature. And much criticism has been launched by environmentalists at Christianity for its overt anthropocentrism, or human-centered view of the universe. And some have argued in defense some have argued instead of anthropocentrism for a more egalitarian or biocentric view of the world, or life-centered view of the world, where human beings are among equals among living things. And this has resulted in a bit of a cultural war between more extreme versions of biocentrism and environmentalism and counter-assertions by those who want to defend anthropocentrism, most often Christians, and invoking the right to exercise dominion over the earth. But as we've just heard, that notion of Adam and Eve's responsibility over the earth might be a misinterpretation. Of course, Hugh Nibley was famous for having criticized the idea of dominion as suggesting any sort of license to do as we wish. But in a religion that places such strong emphasis on God's plan for humankind as his offspring, and that suggests that the creation was intended for human habitation and human experience as we strive to have families and build communities, there is often little tolerance for a biocentric kind of argument. Latter-day Saints often understand stewardship to imply the responsibility to develop and even redeem untouched land, but not the need to, say, protect wilderness or species. Moreover, and so that's one way of acknowledging what I think Margaret was saying about the problematic and maybe different interpretations of the word stewardship. Moreover, because climate change has raised concerns about population, the Latter-day Saint value of protecting the freedom of a couple to choose the size of their own family has seemed to be in jeopardy. For many Latter-day Saints, there is, quote, enough and to spare, according to God's promises in section 104, and that means environmentalism contains a lot of overblown worry. When faced with these obstacles, it is tempting to conclude either, on the one hand, that climate change is not real, or that Mormonism is utterly inadequate to meet the challenges of climate change and should be discarded. And this polarized understanding is unfortunate, and I think wrong. And I think it drives people needlessly out of the church, or it drives people into a position of defensiveness about climate change that is not effective. It certainly isn't a very effective strategy on the part of environmentalists and climate activists who might want to enroll more people in a concern about climate change when they adopt a position of blaming or shaming worldviews for being wrong. And I've seen plenty of this in my career, both in civic engagement and in scholarship, of environmentalists pushing things that far. And I've tried to point out to them that that seems to be very self-defeating. I would instead argue that climate change and environmental problems in general call us to assist and encourage traditions, to identify values and beliefs that can motivate believers. I'm less concerned whether or not others agree with me on the facts of climate change or they agree with me on the proper role of government or proper size of government. I'm more interested in knowing if we can find common ground on finding ways to make effective difference in the way that we take care of the earth. And I think this is the value of what we're doing here on this panel of eco-theological work. We are accepting the reality of problems in the environment and then seeking ways to revive a tradition so that it can prove adequate to the problems that we face. And in this sense, I would say that eco-theology, or the theology of religion in the environment, is faithful work in that it sees traditions as dynamic and revelatory rather than static and ideological. Latter-day Saints should recognize that a belief in continuing revelation is not merely hope for new teachings from the prophets, which it may involve, but also for new ways of imagining, rethinking, and repurposing what has already been revealed. When we consider that a root meaning of the word religion is to reread and rethink, we are reminded that one does not have to forsake one's religion just to confront a problem that had not been anticipated. Tradition, and we could make a long list of problems that hadn't been anticipated even as many as 20 years ago, opioid addiction or pornography addictions. I could go on, right? But the religion finds resources to respond to new problems in a faithful way. Traditions prove their relevance and vitality by doing this kind of imaginative work in the face of unprecedented challenges. And by contrast, adherents of religion can risk contradicting the very tradition they seek to defend by denying a reality that will not go away. So in the interest of symmetry here, I want to propose 4 reasons Christians, and Latter-day Saints in particular, should care about and respond to the challenges presented by climate change. I've written it quite extensively about our Latter-day Saint faith and environmental values. So I could give a very long list here, but I think these are 4 that are relevant to the points I've raised earlier. First, the sanctity of human life. Climate change presents particular dangers to the world's poor, who, because of economic and ecological vulnerabilities, are more likely to be devastated by changes in temperature, sea levels, and weather extremes. Taking care of the poor, and we've seen this just recently in the Panhandle, taking care of the poor is a high priority in Latter-day Saint belief. So much so that in the same verse where the Lord promises that there is enough and to spare, he commands, of course, that in order to be assured of that promise, it must be done in his way, or else we risk damnation. Actually, if you continue to read those verses, they're very condemning of our selfishness. And that way, the Lord explains, is through what is known as the law of consecration, whereby those with more than they need give to those who have less. And environmental problems are often problems of distribution of resources, so this is a very valuable principle. Secondly, the sanctity of biological life and not just human life. Human-centered or anthropocentric beliefs need not result in indifference to non-human life. This is a really important point because I think in that polarization that I was alluding to, it's a false dichotomy to imagine that we have to take care of one or the other, and sanctity of all of life is central to our theology and I think is workable for our religion, even though we are very admittedly anthropocentric. Such indifference towards non-human life contradicts our own life as human beings in any case, and our love of human beings, because we are biological. There's no room for believing that we have to choose between the spotted owl and the logger. And if you've read the marvelous talk by Elder Marcus Nash about stewardship on the LDS.org website and in the Mormon newsroom, he makes this point very strongly. Christians believe God created a world he pronounced good long before humans even showed up, and commanded not only humans but plants and animals to multiply and replenish. It seems that God values a world full of life. Latter-day Saints believe, moreover, that all of life is intended to fulfill the measure of its creation, which includes joy and rejoicing in posterity. This is radical in the Judeo-Christian tradition. We hold firmly to the idea of the sanctity of human reproduction and take great care, therefore, to ensure proper moral treatment of sexuality. I see no reason to believe that the earth's reproductive capacities that have given life to every living thing and to human life in particular should not be similarly safeguarded as sacred. Abuse, promiscuity, greed, and commodification of our life-giving sexual powers are deemed sinful. So why can Latter-day Saints not also imagine that abuse, promiscuous and greedy consumption, and commodification of nature are likewise sinful? If climate change threatens the Earth's remarkable capacity to regulate the climate that has made our human civilization possible and that has allowed a stunning flourishing of all life, why should the fact of our impact on the climate not be regarded as a serious question that must be met with serious sobriety? Third, future generations. The great prophecy of Malachi, which lies at the heart of the restoration, states that, quote, Elijah shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. The fate of the earth, in other words, appears to lie in the balance if we don't live with greater respect for and awareness of the past and the future, and ethics of presentism simply will not do. Latter-day Saint belief makes it clear that if we aspire to live in God's kingdom without due consideration of our impact on future generations, we will not end up deserving a place in the very kingdom we hope is coming here. In other words, Latter-day Saints are simply trying to earn the right to remain, or at least return to the earth. As Pope Francis has reminded us in his marvelous encyclical on the climate, if families are important, then protecting communities and their relationship to the natural world and safeguarding future generations is vital to the protection of the family. since this earth was created for us as a home to intentionally and willfully leave the world more uninhabitable for future generations, would be a sin of enormous proportions. Finally, freedom. I have no argument with the need to preserve freedom. To argue with that would be silly. But I do have an argument with the belief that freedom is an end in itself and is more important than responsibility. Freedom is, in fact, what guarantees responsibility and accountability. God does not stop us or prevent us from making mistakes in our theology. So while it is his power to redeem our weaknesses and make them strong, this does not give us the liberty to theologize our mistakes and justify ourselves in our errors, as if God intended us to make mistakes. Jesus said, "It must needs be that offenses come, but woe unto him by whom they come." There is, too, a narrow definition of individual accountability that often shrugs off concerns about the responsibilities to the broader human and biotic communities upon which we all depend, and I do not believe that this is accountable at all. Let's be clear, no one is free if one cannot sustain oneself and one's family. I am not preserving freedom if my capacity to sustain myself is used to glut myself on the earth's resources, while others are increasingly compromised in their ability to provide for themselves. I might be free from debt by becoming more financially and temporally self-reliant, but if that self-reliance is an end in itself and excludes a recognition of my interdependence among all living things and ignores the decreasing freedoms of others, my self-reliance is merely an excuse to ignore the debt I have to others, to nature, and to God. My children and grandchildren and others across the world are less free if they have fewer choices about where and how to live because of my choices. The market is not free if I cannot choose clean and renewable energy or less impactful goods and services, such as affordable and healthy local produce or public transportation, or if I cannot see the real cost of what I am purchasing. And let's remember that these kinds of protections require good policy and proactive government. Not necessarily big government, but proactive government, responsive government. And let's remember that freedom is only meaningful if there is meaningful choice and collective responsibility for our common home of the earth. In conclusion, climate change is a challenge, but also an opportunity for religious people to dust off our theology and awaken ourselves to the wonder and responsibility that nature inspires. The fact of the creation is of such magnitude and importance, it is no wonder that every prophet in the scriptures insists that all ethics begin by remembering that we are created beings subject to a creator. Wondering why we should take care of the earth is like wondering why, if we are going to die, we should bother being concerned about life at all. I find such attitudes profoundly irreligious. My hope is that our American and my Latter-day Saint culture can change to a point that we would all feel our collective failure the next time someone feels tempted to wonder aloud if they should care. Thank you.
George, thank you very much. A wonderful reflection on all of the LDS values that really do drive the fundamental decision that we make on how we treat the world and each other and actually build these bonds of love that Margaret was talking about. In fact, Margaret, I wondered if you'd like to ask George a question or make a comment at this point.
Yes, I think so. First, I heard this before, and I have to say, when I heard it the second time, I found far more in it. I think you set out very clearly the practical dilemmas that ordinary people face in trying to implement the ideals of the biblical pictures and all the things which I was sort of sketching out. So it's not so much a question to George as a thanks, because you've been actually working out what these things mean in reality, how we live, how we make choices, how we purchase things, and so forth. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you. I think actually maybe a better presentation that's a little easier to give is one that just talks about the practical things that we ought to be doing day to day anyway. And I find that when people catch a glimpse of what it might mean to be a better I'm trying not to use the word steward, a better caretaker, better worshiper of the Creator, I think we would be really much more careful about how we eat, how we shop, why we shop, why we consume, what we consume, where we travel, why we travel, how we travel, because these things all have impact on the earth, whether or not independent of the issue of climate change, and they're all basic opportunities for good stewardship.
Hey, George, I would say that as you were talking, I heard lots of threads of temple theology coming through, and I wondered if you could comment just briefly on how you think the LDS temple and what it stands for and the experiences that we have there could be a unifying and inspiring source of sound decision-making for people trying to figure out how to be practically engaged with these environmental problems.
That's a great question. It's one of my favorite thoughts, actually. Joseph Smith restored 3 accounts of the creation through the temple ceremony, the book of Abraham, and the book of Moses. And that tells me that our account of the creation is very important and something we ought to pay quite a bit of attention to. And I could go on, but there are several doctrinal principles in those accounts that really jump out and stand out in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Not maybe necessarily because they're radically unique, but because they're so explicitly stated. For example, that the earth is created spiritually before it's created physically, and that plants and animals are identified as living souls. I alluded to the idea that all life is entitled to joy in its posterity. That's a pretty explicitly stated principle of what we could call biodiversity, right? Many other aspects of the account, the human role in the creation, both premortal and mortal existence, imply that we are ongoingly participating in the creation of the world and that we are asked to be partnering with God. The fact that Satan shows up right away and tries to disrupt that relationship between human beings and the natural world is a central lesson, I think, about how important our relationship to the natural world is to our own sense of ourselves and our sense of moral responsibility. So there's a lot there to think about.
You don't see those things if you don't go in looking for.
Right.
What are the environmental lessons I should learn this trip to the temple?
Yeah.
And you'll be surprised, I think, what shows up.
David or Jacob, do you want to?
I just had one thing for George. At the very beginning, you said that in order to repent or change your relationship to the environment, you need a reason for hope. And I was wondering what your greatest reason for hope is personally.
Well, one of my favorite scriptural passages is in section 88, where Christ is identified as in the light of the sun and in the light of the moon, and is the light by which we perceive things. And I can't quote it directly, but you probably all know those verses. And for me, when I am in the natural world and I try to get outside as often as I can, I feel a very close communion with God. And that gives me great hope. I mean, I feel that, I have family members and friends who don't go to church, but they feel God or they feel a kind of spirituality in the natural world. So I'm just all believing in the healing powers of nature. And I think and I feel that as I've worked to try to be involved in environmental stewardship in a variety of different ways, I feel like I'm living my religion in a way that's very satisfying and meaningful to me, and it gives me that hope too. I mean, I think it's easy to get overwhelmed, by the story of something like climate change or other environmental problems can be overwhelming because you can't get a toehold on what you're supposed to do to make a difference. But I think if you live on the principles of the gospel, you get that toehold, and it gives you hope. I think God just is pleased to see us trying to live as if generations are going to go on and on, even if they aren't. We don't know, but I think we should live that way anyway.
David, we'll give you the last volley here. You want to ask George a question.
Thank you, Jack. George, thank you very much for your presentation. The question I wanted to ask was, as you've gone out, and you mentioned you spoke at Patriarch Bartholomew's conference with Margaret, and as you've gone to those types of gatherings, have you noticed that there are expectations or stereotypes or assumptions that people have had of you as an LDS speaker and what you might say regarding the environment? Or do they have no expectations, no ideas of what a Latter-day Saint might think on the topic?
That's a great question. I think almost universally the reaction is a little bit of surprise. Oh, a Latter-day Saint who's concerned about the environment, and I think that's weird and disappointing. I'm like, why would that be strange? I know lots and lots of members of my faith who are engaged in environmental work of a variety of different kinds, certainly many here at BYU, some of whom, Paul Cox in our faith tradition has won the Nobel, it's the equivalent, they call it the Nobel of the Environment prize for saving the rainforest in Samoa. He lives right here in Provo, and he's a very devout member of the church. I mean, I find no end of interesting examples of living these principles in the religion, but the reputation is one that sort of precedes me almost always, and there's a bit of surprise that they might have expected me to give a speech about why none of this matters, and I don't ever say such things, but they are, I would say, gratified, that there's common ground, and they're eager to talk more. They really find it pretty fascinating, actually.
Excellent. Well, if all spirit is matter, it all matters in a lot of ways. Join me in thanking our speakers so far this session.